Welcome to Loup TV. I'm Gene along with Doug for Friday, March 11th. We have 4 topics today. The evolution of modern warfare with tech. Second is what's going on with Chinese stocks and Chinese tech stocks. Third, we're going to talk about the impact of how the car dealerships are evolving related to electrification. And lastly, we're going to go to the toy department and talk about an old favorite for those of you who've been following tech, which is Magic Leap and their move into the enterprise. We'll go to the top, Doug, and the latest in terms of we've talked more recently just about how tech has had a bigger influence geopolitically, and more recently, Facebook Meta has made some changes to how they are allowing, what kind of content that they're allowing. Specifically, they have policies that do not allow you to make threats or to invoke violence, but they are loosening some of those regulations around content that's being created in Ukraine and directed towards Russia. Correct me, Doug, if I'm getting this all correct, and essentially kind of evolving that that policy. What I thought was set in stone is not set in stone. At the same time, speaking of tech and the modern world, the number of VPN downloads, VPNs, of course, are one way to avoid government restrictions around what content you can see on the internet. VPN app downloads in Russia have reportedly up 1,600%. I'm forgetting the source here, over the last 2 weeks. And I think that would be also a sign that tech is playing a bigger impact on trying to get around some of these requirements. And so when you kind of think about this evolution, we've talked about, as I mentioned, tech and modern warfare, and what does this latest move by Facebook Meta mean relative to that conversation?
It's just another example of how important I think these platforms are in terms of information and speech, which are a growing component of warfare. I mean, they've always been important. You go back to World War II and you look at how propaganda was used then. Really, it was probably the mainstream emergence of wartime propaganda. And now we have these tools where everyone's connected, everyone can create propaganda and express their views. And specifically what Facebook's allowing right now is, I'll read exactly the quote from the Meta spokesperson. We are allowing forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech, such as death to the Russian invaders. And whether you think someone should or shouldn't be able to say that particular phrase, to me is sort of irrelevant. And it highlights the bigger problem that we've had with these platforms for a long time now, which is their policies have consistently been a moving target where they will change them to sort of justify what they think maybe society wants at any given time, instead of just adhering to a simple rule around speech. Either something should be allowed or not allowed. And I think the flexibility is harming their credibility and will harm their credibility long term. Again, regardless of how you feel about this particular issue, I think the wavering that they've done with speech has been harmful, and it might result in people looking to other platforms.
I'm going to leave it there. We'll jump to our second topic, which is China tech, and China stocks more broadly have been under pressure a lot more recently. There, of course, is the geopolitical aspect where investors are anticipating some of the fallout from the Ukraine to move towards Asia and impact those. We look at what happened to Yandex. It's still halted in trading. That's the Google of Russia. And there is a belief by some investors that could happen, that kind of fallout could happen eventually in some of the Chinese names. But there also has been by U.S. Securities regulators that some of the larger Chinese listed companies, not the big tech ones, but have not been doing their block and tackle, their accounting properly. And so there's some deficiencies there. So they may be delisted. And then today we have DiDi, the ride sharing, which is still listed in the US, but is planning a transition over to be listed in Hong Kong. That listing now has been stopped by the Chinese government because they say there's some data breaches, essentially kind of putting up that roadblock. So I'm going to zero in. Before we get too negative on DiDi here, I just want to mention from its peak, it's down, call it 85% from its peak a year and plus ago. But there are a lot of SPACs in the U.S. that are down 85%. That almost feels like the new, not quite norm, but that happens more often than I'm sure we like to think about. So the question is, what is it about the Chinese government? Why all of a sudden do they want to pull the plug here on this Hong Kong listing?
I think it's the same argument that they had offered before, which is why they want DiDi to delist from the NYSE, which is they've talked about some sort of loose data policies and essentially breaches of policy that the Chinese government has set relative to user data and what might be accessible with them being a US listed company. And so the compromise was thought to be that they could then move their listing to Hong Kong, delist from the NYSE, kind of minimize investor pain by doing that. And it's become pretty apparent.
And those investors, it would have been made whole as it went over to Hong Kong.
Well, not whole, I wouldn't use that word, but I would say that their ownership in theory was supposed to be able to be transferred. That's correct. But they'd still be down, whatever amount that they're nominally down from where they bought the stock.
I understand, but of course, if there's no Hong Kong listing, there's no transfer of value. And eventually, can the Chinese government just say you have to delist in the U.S.?
They've sort of already said that, in my opinion. They've already made the point to DiDi, and DiDi has said that this is their ongoing plan. I think that's why shares are reacting the way that they are. So it's a problem for DiDi. I think it does open up a broader question just about China more broadly. And we've been talking about this internally, but there was kind of a sentiment earlier this year that sort of China was uninvestable. And when you hear the words uninvestable, sometimes you can be contrarian and buck the tide. And when things are uninvestable, they're cheap. You look at things like Alibaba. Charlie Munger is a huge fan of Alibaba because if you look at the actual revenue, you look at the valuation that you're paying for the assets that underlie it, it does look cheap. But the problem is the way that the Chinese government, I think, is sort of standing off with the US brings into question about whether you even own the assets to begin with. And so I think the idea that China is uninvestable is probably becoming more powerful by the day.
I wonder how this plays into Apple. I don't know if they still have a small ownership in DiDi, but how that would ultimately play out. And of course, even at its peak, it doesn't add up to anything for Apple's shareholders. DiDi at its peak and down 85% doesn't change any of the equation. I just wonder from a policy, from a geopolitical, from an Apple standpoint, I should be aware. Have they done anything? I'm not sure if they've done anything yet, but any thoughts on that?
In terms of Apple, I don't think it really matters at this point to the story. I think it's all about the listing transfer. It's probably all that matters.
Makes sense. Next, we'll talk about EVs and how they're having an impact on the way car dealerships are set up. This is not specific to any company. The Wall Street Journal did do a story, talked about companies like Lucid and Rivian and Tesla, kind of how they go direct to the consumer. They don't have big showrooms / lots where they keep 150 vehicles on and try to have this kind of variable pricing. Even when they say it's set pricing, there's variable pricing. They don't, the EV companies aren't taking to that. They have a simple set pricing model. And the article basically calls into question like it brings up the question, where is the model for traditional car dealerships? And I would, just as a quick aside, my knowledge of this space is that the basic model for car dealerships is to get people into the showroom and then try to get you to purchase something that day. That's why they keep vehicles on inventory, is because they know how hard it is to actually get you into that showroom. And so they want to get you to purchase that vehicle, and then they want to create a long-term value by selling basically service and maintenance. That's where they make most of their money. They don't, of course, make money on the car. It is on the financing, the service, and the maintenance. And so when you drive by these big, beautiful dealerships, that the dealers are required to invest money in. It's not Mercedes and Ford. They're not paying these dealers for doing that. These dealers finance that themselves. They own a lot of real estate. Those big lots are worth something, But when you think about how this plays out, I just want you to kind of jump forward 10 years from now. And this is less about a question about the speed of electrification, more of a question about how the business models are evolving around purchasing cars. Where do you think that the average dealer stands? Do you think they're in an equal position 10 years from now? Do you think they're in a more compromised position? How does it look for them in 2030?
The car buying experience in a dealership sucks. I think that would be consensus. I don't think that that's shocking to say. And Carvana has built a business off of the idea that nobody wants to go into a dealership and be hard sold a car that they have to buy that day. And so I agree with that premise. I do think that there's two things that are worth thinking about. One is CarMax, which is sort of trying to compete with Carvana by offering a purely online sale. And then they give the customer the option: do you want us to deliver it to your door like like Carvana does, or do you want to come to one of our dealerships and pick it up? The vast majority of customers, CarMax customers, still go to the dealership. And so I think that that's an interesting point to say that people still do have some desire, I think, to pick something up from a dealership, especially because it's such a high dollar item, and by going to a retail vendor, I think you maybe feel like you have more recourse. You might say, hey, I don't like what this car looks like. I'm not going to pay for it, or I reject picking it up. So I think there's something about the emotion of buying a car that is relevant here. But the second point is, I do think that dealerships will look quite different in 10 years than they do today. I think that the sales model needs to change. And I think that people still get value from being able to go and test drive cars. And so to me, maybe it turns into something more like a showroom. We've talked about this in maybe like the consumer electronics space, where people want to go and experience products and then maybe they buy them online later. But I think there's still a place for the dealership in a very much different experiential way than we have today.
And so I would agree with that too. I think probably the showroom and the vehicles will still need to be maintenance. That will remain. The lot piece, where all that inventory, that eventually is going to go away. Perhaps there's a world of ride sharing and you need a place to keep those vehicles at night. And so you could see, I think, a dealership model evolve to be, if I think Ford has talked about getting into a network. But my concern would be if I was a traditional, let's say Ford or GM, and the growth is coming from some of these other EV players, eventually you're right, is that you're going to have a city, take a city of like Minneapolis, for example. I don't know how many car dealerships there are here, but there is, I think, one, maybe two Tesla dealerships. And that seems to be doing just fine. Maybe it ends up being 3 or 4, but it's going to be a net reduction. And I suspect you don't need as many showrooms and down the road. You do need showrooms, but you probably don't need as many. I would just kind of put the over under here. Probably a business that I would not want to be in longer term. I'm sure incredible people that are in that business, but it just feels like there's just so many open moves. I'll leave you. I'll give you the final word on this. Somebody gives you a pitch to get into to be a, I don't know, you pick the brand dealer. Are you interested?
Would depend on the brand. But I think that there's always an opportunity in business to provide great service. And so to me, where does the dealership evolve? If they can create an experience that is maybe higher touch, that it is very high quality in terms of service, and much less of this kind of pressure cooker, sit you in the office and they get you to the finance office and it takes 4 hours to buy a car. I think dealerships that figure that out can survive, because I think that service still does sell. And so that's where we kind of have to reorient the idea around is, can we make it a great experience? Can we make the service side of it, customer service side of it, really good? I think that could be, the future of it. And maybe there are fewer dealerships, particularly because I don't think all those dealerships are very good at service. So the ones that serve well will survive.
And just to make an amendment on what I said before, if somebody pitched me on just having a service center, a high quality service center for vehicles, I'd be all game for that. I think that is where the value ultimately is, less on the sales, almost none on the sales piece. We're going to wrap up this week in the toy department with a company that the many longtime tech followers may remember. That, of course, is Magic Leap, the first company to talk about wearable augmented reality. That company has had a lot of fits and starts over the years, and we haven't heard much from them recently until today when they have announced that they're going to have, I think it's like a $2,500 enterprise level AR glasses. That isn't why it made it into the toy department. The reason why it made it in the toy department is the comment from their CEO. Then she said that the consumer level AR is still a long ways away, or is not intimate, I think was the comment. And my question, this is something that you said, Doug, that we're still a long ways away from the consumer piece. And when you hear this data point from Magic Leap, does it change? I think you've said all along that we're not going to see the AR glasses from MR glasses from Apple this year. Your bet is 2023, or you maybe even said 2024. Does that 2023, 2024 prediction change based on what we're hearing from Magic Leap today?
It doesn't change, but I would agree. It kind of speaks my language in that I just don't think we figured out what that killer use case is to make AR glasses anything more than sort of a novelty for the consumer.
For the consumer, not for the enterprise. The enterprise, there's value.
Maybe. I think we're still figuring that too. And that's
Microsoft would say there is with HoloLens. It seems to be going well.
How many do you think they've sold though?
Not many, but it's, and there's,
right.
when you look at the number
that tells
of
you everything you need to know, I think.
Well,
I'm not saying it's not worth experimenting with. It is. But I think that 5 years ago, people thought AR was going to be everywhere imminently. And here we are, and it's nowhere. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that for a long time, we've talked about there's enterprise applications. Maybe Microsoft is focusing on them. Obviously, I think that some of these other players are trying to figure out how can we serve enterprise first before we even think about the consumer. And the point I'm trying to make is I don't think we've even figured out a really incredible, can't live without it experience for the enterprise yet, where everybody's walking around with HoloLenses. It's just not happening yet. And so it's not that I think AR is terrible or that it shouldn't exist. It should exist, but I think it's still much earlier than people want to maybe admit. And it's going to take a long time for us to figure out if there is even a viable consumer application for it.
I'm going to take the final word. I think I largely agree. It's going to take time. I think we're going to see Apple's first MR headset, at least a prototype of it, next year at WWDC. That would be 2023. I think that the opportunity around AR still is significant. I still think it's the next tech user interface. On behalf of the toy department, Doug and Gene and Loup TV, bye for now.